So today we are kind of like going off of what we talked about yesterday, kind of expanding on it and diving a little bit deeper into certain things. This lesson is called Audient Signal Flow, and it's just kind of more about like what all those pieces that did that we kind of like talked about yesterday and went over. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into them today. An 8-second delay is not that bad. It's not that bad. All right, so let's just review the input and monitor path real quick with a slightly different like visuals here. So first you got the source and it transmits into the mic or DI, which is patched into the mic pre-input, which is assigned or selected into the channel. Then that is routed through the group out or direct out with a cable into the MTR. Oh, that's good, better than usual, nice. So the source can be a vocal, drum, guitar, keyboard, anything in that box right there. And that's transmitted through the air or through a cable or something like that into the mic or DI. DI is direct input. It's a box that you use to convert it into, you can split it or change it to like a slightly different level there. Patched is with a cable into the mic pre-input, and that's the amplifier that brings the signal up to line level there. And then you assign it or select it, which is plugging it into the correct channel. And on the channel, we've got the EQ, the pan, the fader, aux ins, stuff like that. And that you use buttons to route it to the group out or direct out. Remember the routing matrix at the top of the channel? That's how you route it. The Audient has a group out, and when we talk about the O2R, which is it's the digital mixer we're going to be talking about later on this module, the O2R has direct outs. And yesterday I was teaching a friend of mine at his place yesterday afternoon, and we were talking about different mixers, and a lot of mixers there's a lot of mixers that have group outs or direct outs. So it's something you definitely want to keep in mind, especially if you're interested in buying a mixer one day and getting involved with that. You definitely want to keep your eye on group outs and direct outs, because different mixers allow you to route into the DAW in different ways, and you'll want to kind of learn more about that. We looked at like an Allen and Heath that has a direct out for every single channel. So that means it had 16 channels, and so that means he basically can record 16 tracks of audio at the same time into his audio interface, assuming that he has 16 inputs on his audio interface. Anyway, then we use a cable to patch it into the multi-track recorder, and then of course that multi-track recorder is the DAW with the computer interface or ADAT or tape, something like that. These days it's almost always DAW. So next we're going to go from the monitor path where we're hearing the signal, where we're listening to everything. So we start with the MTR, which is a DAW, ADAT or tape, and it goes back with a cable patched into the line or tape in. The knob that's on there is a trim knob. It's not a gain knob. It's not a preamp there. It's actually something that puts it at unity, and it's letting more or less through. Think about a trim knob or a fader on your channel. These are kind of like, they work similarly to how your water pressure works in your home coming from the city. If you have a tap and the faucet, when you turn that on, it doesn't start up a generator that pumps water into your house. What it does is there's a certain amount of water pressure that's just in the city at all times, and so that water pressure comes up into your house, and when you open up the faucet, it just lets the water come through. So if you have a house, if you're like at an old house and like the top of it and there's not a lot of water pressure. I lived in a place in London back in the late 90s that basically had no water pressure. So whenever you took a shower in the very top shower, it just felt like it was just kind of somebody drooling on you. It was just like a bleh type of thing. It was very, very little water that came out. And we always had a joke about that because it was like no water pressure, so the water barely came out of that thing. So that's really what a trim knob does. That's what a fader is. As opposed to as opposed to a mic pre. A mic pre actually has a preamp and has a gain knob. And that gain knob is actually like a pump that turns on that boosts the water level for you. So that's the difference between those. From there, from your line or tape in, select it it's in the, you're not plugging it in, you're plugging it into the line or tape in. So the next part's a little bit weird, but that goes into the channel. It has the EQ, the pan, the fader, the aux, that kind of stuff. Then you use a button to route it to the left-right mix bus, and that button on the Audient is the mix button. It says mix, you push the button, and it routes the signal to your left-right mix bus. And then that goes to your master fader. Now, down here I do have, it says this is what you're recording. Well, when you're recording, what you're recording is actually the signal from the left-right mix bus. So it's the signal after the left-right mix bus. So there's that master fader that's on the right-hand side of all your consoles. Well, if you turn that up or down, it's going to affect your stereo recording. The stereo recording is what we listen to in iTunes or whatever. So that's your MP3, that's your CD, that's your WAV file. That's being recorded onto a 2-track recorder or some kind of recorder. The 2-track recorder can be, again, it can be a DAW, it could be an ADAT, it could be whatever, but it's just recording stereo. So when you're recording your left-right mix bus, you've got to make sure you don't ever touch that. Nico says, I know we're talking about the Audient, but is this a typical signal flow for any recording project? Yes. Well, it's a typical signal flow for any kind of any kind of multi-track recording project, because for multi-track recording projects, generally you're going to have your input path and you're going to have your monitor path. Even if you're going directly into Pro Tools itself, it's a similar flow to this. And actually in Pro Tools, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but in Pro Tools we did talk about there's an option in there that says pre-fader metering. And that's under options or view or something like that. I'd have to look to be exactly sure. But it says pre-fader metering, and it's a box that you can check on or off. And basically what that does is your meters will either be pre or post fader, either the input side or the monitor side. So if they're pre-fader, that means you're actually seeing the meters for your input path, your recording levels. But if you're doing pre-fader metering is turned off, that means the meters are coming after your faders. So if you turn down the fader, that meter is going to go down as well. It's reflecting what your output level is, which is essentially your monitor path. So to answer your question, yes, we're talking about the Audient right now, but this input path, monitor path, all this whole signal flow stuff is really for any desk, any console, any kind of recording thing that you're doing. It's the same thing. You might not have all the same pieces of the puzzle in here. For example, if you're recording straight into Pro Tools, you're just going into the back of your audio interface. So you're not going to the channel will be inside of your DAW. So you're not going to have a physical channel there. You're not going to necessarily have the physical stuff. But if you're recording straight into your audio interface with a microphone, you still have, you still have a mic pre-input. It's just built into your audio interface. So the answer is, yeah, this kind of applies to everything. Just certain things are going to be maybe a little bit different looking. But the left-right mix bus, this would be your master fader in Pro Tools, or it's your main fader on any of your consoles. And this is what you're really recording. Now you can see I put a little box here on the side. This box here on the side is another physical thing that you would plug in. So what you do is you'd come out of the outputs of your left-right mix bus into some kind of 2-track recorder, like if you've brought your laptop to school, you might have your own audio interface and record into your laptop. Or I'm going to show you when we talk about patching, I'm going to show you how to reroute that audio back into Pro Tools itself, so you can record it into Pro Tools in the same session at school. Now you want to obviously, well maybe not obviously, but after all this, it should be obvious. You want to listen to the monitor path on the 2-track recorder, because this side over here on the left is the input path of that 2-track recorder, and the right side is the monitor path of the 2-track recorder. So you want to make sure you listen to that. So this assign button here sends it to the control room level here, but your control room level, if you remember, and we're going to talk about this today, if you remember, for the source, there was mix or tape 1, tape 2, tape 3. Well, that tape 1, tape 2, and tape 3, that's your 2-track recorder right here. So that's going to be our source. That's when we're talking about our source. So if you are recording onto a 2-track or some kind of a audio interface or something like that, then you will want to listen to the other side of that. And there's several different ways to do that, which we're going to talk about today. So then you get that into your control room level there, and that control room level is hardwired with a cable into your amplifier and your speaker. So you got your speakers here, and inside the box I put amplifier and speaker because I want you to understand that your speakers, no matter, even if they are what they call powered monitors, they're not just a speaker. There's an amplifier and a speaker. With powered monitors, the amplifier is built into the speaker itself. That's why they're so heavy. But if you have non-powered monitors, then your amplifier is going to be another piece of hardware that you've got. Cool, so that's just a little review that I wanted to go over with you real quick before we get going with everything today. And we're going to be reviewing that every day this week just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. All right. So going through this stuff here, we have our XLR input, we have our line input here, and numbers 3 and 4 are the send and returns for our inserts. It's all right down here, and remember this is on the input path here. This dark gray area is the input path. Over here on the left there is no microphone input, there's no XLR because it's only a line input. So because always coming back from your tape, always coming back from your multi-track recorder, it's always going to be line level. So there's no microphone for this side over here. And you have your send and return. So what this means is we can have an insert on the input path or an insert on the monitor path. Now let me ask you a question. Since we're only dealing with a short delay today, I can ask you this question. If I want to record my kick drum, if I'm recording my drums live, I've got let's say I've got 4 or 5 different drum microphones, and I want to record my kick drum with a compressor on it. I want to have that multi-track recorder with a compressor on the kick drum. Is that going to be an insert on my input path or an insert on my monitor path? Go ahead and answer that for me real quick. Is that an insert on my input path or an insert on my monitor path, that compressor? Which would it be? Anybody have any guesses? What I asked is if you're recording your kick drum with a compressor, would you put that compressor as an insert on the input path or the monitor path? And this is a question for anybody who wants to take a guess at it. Yep, it's the input path for sure, the input path, exactly. The reason why is because your recording on the input path is what's going into your multi-track recorder, and your monitor path is what's coming out of your multi-track recorder. So you want to make sure, yes, absolutely, yep, yep. So that's a really, it's good to understand this stuff because if you want to record with the compressor on it, that's great. If you understand what you're doing with compressors and you feel confident in your ability with compressors, record it with it because that way you're going to get that sound of that compressor baked into your audio. But if you're not sure about it, you can put the compressor on as a plug-in in your DAW, or if you have a hardware compressor, you just run it through the hardware compressor. So when you're recording the song as a whole song with everything, you're still going to get that compressor sound, but the raw recording does not have the does not have it. 10 points for Gryffindor. Yeah, okay. Are you sure you're in Gryffindor? Right. Okay. So now we've got the input pod here, and remember, let's go look at this here. What we're looking at right now is this section right here. What we were looking at before was the back, and then this here right now is the input pod. So the number 1 is a long meter, number 2 is the short meter, and these can be switched by clicking the meter button here, number 6, which in this case MTR does not stand for multi-track recorder, it stands for meter. That's an Audient thing. Oh, sorry. Number 3 here is the insert button for your monitor path. So if you've got the signal coming back from your tape machine, then that's going to be right here if you want to put an insert onto that one there. Or number 7 here is number 7 here is the insert for your input path. So if you wanted to record that kick drum with the compressor, you'd make sure you plug the compressor into the input path and you press this button right here. Number 4 is your trim. Remember, that's not a gain. Number 5 is the line mic line button. What that means is if the button is up, it's going to be the microphone input. If the button is down, it's going to be the line input. So if you're using like a keyboard or something like that to come into channel 1, for example, then you want to make sure you press the button down so it's getting the signal from the line input and not the microphone input. On the Audient, you can have both things plugged in at the same time. When you talked about the Mackie 1604, what you talked about in Mod 1, if you plug in a line level 1/4 inch input, it's going to override that microphone input. So you can't have both plugged in at the same time. You can either have a microphone plugged in or 1/4-inch cable plugged in, but if you have both, it's going to pay attention to that 1/4-inch cable, not the microphone cable. The Yamaha O2R is the same way. So the Audient and the SSL, those have a button to switch between them, so you can have them both plugged in at the same time, but you got to choose which one you're paying attention to. And that's number 5 right over here. All right, number 8 is your gain knob. This is a gain knob, so it's actually, it's turning on that pump that's going to make it louder. So number 8 there, it is going to actually add into it and make it louder. We're bringing the microphone level up to the correct level. Number 9 is the phase shift, so you can change that phase. Number 10 is the phantom power if you have a condenser mic, and number 11 is the high pass filter, which is I don't remember exactly what it is on the Audient. It does say it in the instructions. Here, let's just go up here and grab. I think it did. Not this one. Hold on, let's just see. I'm curious if the manual actually talks about that. Number 11, it does not. Is it the same with similar mixing boards? Yeah, all the mixing boards are very, very similar to each other, which means that there's going to be 2 types of mixing consoles in regards to your mic input or your line input. One type, which you've already encountered with the, oh, sorry, you said, is it the same with smaller mixing boards? It depends on the board. Most smaller mixing boards are similar more to the Mackie 1604, where you plug something in and it flips it back and forth. The smaller mixing boards also may have some of this stuff. They may not. They all have a phantom power. And some of them have phase shift, and some of them have a high pass filter. Not all of them. It depends on your mixing board. And then as far as the mic line thing, most of the smaller boards act more like the Mackie 1604, where if you plug a 1/4-inch cable in, it's going to override that microphone cable. So that's pretty common. All right, the routing matrix. Here's our routing matrix. This is how we send the signal out to our multi-track recorder. Remember, just whatever button you push, that's what channel it's going to come into on the multi-track recorder. So if you've got a routing matrix like this, it's really easy to use. You just say, I want to record into channel 5. So you just push the button for channel 5. If you want to record into channel 22, you push shift and you push the button here for 22. Make sure you got that shift button. Then you got pan, then you've got your long fader. If you use the long fader when you want to do some subgrouping, okay? Subgrouping is something we do when we're coming from the monitor path. So that's when you'd use the long fader. Basically, number 4 here changes it to the monitor path. Turns into antennet. I don't know what that means. Eduardo, I don't know what that means. But we can talk about it in Zoom. Number 4 here, just see here, it says sends the long fader monitor path signal to the recording matrix for subgroup mixing. That's what that's really used for. And number 3 is your pan knob for the routing matrix. So if you are doing subgroup mixing, you're going to want to use that pan knob. We're going to talk about that. I don't want to get into it in too much detail today, but we are going to talk about it later on. Number 5 is you've got 1 and 2 here. These are for your aux sends. It's your aux send amount. Remember, with your aux sends, you not only have to use the aux sends here, but you also have to use your aux send masters over here, number 3. It's your aux send masters. The antenna. All right. Number 6 is your short fader. So if you want to have your aux send to be on your input path, you can do that. Pre is pre-fader. Up is post fader, down is pre-fader. If you're using your aux sends as for reverbs and delays, stuff like that, you want it to be post fader. If you're using it for headphone mixing, you want it to be pre-fader. Number 8 switches between 7 and 8. So down here I've got a little map for you. 1 and 2 changes into 7 and 8. 3 and 4 changes into 9 and 10, and 5 and 6 changes into 11 and 12. This is with the number 8 button engaged for all your different sets of auxes. Number 9 is your foldback send amount. You've got your foldback here, and then you've got your short fader, your pre, and short fader for both of these here. There is no switch to switch them. Remember, the foldback is a dedicated headphone mix. Then you've got your equalizers, and we're going to dive in a little bit deeper onto your EQs today. You've got your, first of all, you can turn the EQ on and off here with the in button. It's technically what it does is it inserts it into the path. In stands for insert. And so what they mean by this basically is the way these fancier boards work is that the EQ is not always in the signal path, because EQs do color the sound even if they're not really being used. It's another place where you can make that sound a little bit dirty. So what you want to do is you want to keep it out of the signal unless you're using the EQ. So if you're not using an EQ at all, you just basically do not want to have it in the signal path, so you have that button up. Essentially it's just turning it off. It's a little bit different from turning it off, because if you have an EQ in the signal path and it's off, it still could be changing the signal very slightly. So that's why it's like actually taking it out of the path instead of just turning it on and off. So number 1 and number 7 are the same, just this one is for the high frequencies and low frequencies, and this one here is for your mids. Number 2 is to change it into the input path. By default, you can see here is a lighter background. That means it's on the monitor path. And even when it's not used, even when you're not using it, you don't want to push this button when you're not using it. You only want to push this button when you are using it. When you're not using it at all and you have this button up, it's not going to color the sound because it's not in the path. But other EQs, if you have an EQ in the path, even when you're not touching anything, when you have everything straight up and down, it still might color the sound a bit. And that's, I know it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but that's true. That's how this stuff works. Is that as soon as the signal goes through it, it can color that signal path, just because it's something that's turned on. If you have an external EQ, that external EQ is probably got a power source, so it's plugged into the wall. So it could even just be, putting in a little bit of a hum into the signal. So that's why this is completely taking it out of that signal entirely. And you'll see this on the SSL, and you'll see it on Neve as well, and like fancier EQs, fancier boards. Whereas with the Mackie 1604, for example, the EQ is it's always going through the EQ. So there's a little bit of coloration happening, but that's just part of the channel sound of the Mackie, because the Mackie doesn't have an on and in button there. Number 2 and number 8 are the same. This is for your short fader. You've got the EQ here is in the monitor path. You can see by the light background here, and that SF button is for the short fader, which puts it into the input path. So if you do want to use your EQs to color the signal going into your multi-track recorder, you can push that button there, number 2 or number 8. Number 3 is your frequency shift, and number 4 is the gain. It's the trim knob for that frequency shift. Hello, Goshu, how you doing? And then number 5 is the frequency shift for your low shelf, and number 6 is the trim knob for that as well. Number 9, 10, and 11, these are for your fully parametric mid, high mid, and low mid fully parametric EQs, and they are fully parametric because of this bandwidth knob right here. The bandwidth knob is what makes it fully parametric. Otherwise, it's just going to be parametric. So you've got your frequency selection here, you've got your trim knob here to adjust the gain, and then you've got your bandwidth here. Wider bandwidth is going to affect more frequencies, and a lower bandwidth is going to affect less frequencies. Down here you've got the hertz for your low mid frequencies down here, and then you've got the trim knob, and you've got the bandwidth for this. And you can see on these, see how it says kilohertz. So this is 0.45 kilohertz, which is essentially the same as 450 hertz. And you can see down here, this one here goes up to 1.5 K, and this one here starts at 450 hertz. So there's crossover between these two EQs, right? That's what's going on here. So now let's just take a pause on talking about the Audient, and let's just talk about these EQs for a second. So EQs, equalizers, this is an independent gain adjustment for specific groups of frequencies. Now we haven't really talked too much about EQs, but Eduardo says, does it matter high, low, mid? Yes, it does matter which one you use, because they both are going to sound the same, but your high frequencies go up to different frequencies, and your low mids go down to different frequencies. So depending on if you're doing like more low instruments, you want to use the low mid, and if you're doing kind of more high, and you might use both. You might subtract some out of your high frequencies if you want to really focus on that low frequency. You might subtract some out of the high frequency with a high mid one, and you might boost a little bit with your low mid, something like that. Or you might use all of these at the same time. It really depends on what you're trying to do to the signal. But yeah, it certainly matters. So independent gain adjustment for specific groups of frequencies. That's what an EQ is doing. And really, think about an EQ as you've got faders for all your different frequencies, and those faders are adding or subtracting decibels from it, and it's on a specific frequency. So that's really what it's doing. It's like your fader on a channel, but it's like the fader on a channel for a specific frequency. Different types of EQs work in different ways. So here's all the different types of EQs that we have that you're going to find in most DAWs, most things. Let me just go ahead. I'm going to pull up Pro Tools here, and so we can take a look at some of these, just to kind of look at them, and we can also give them a listen as well. And what I'll do is I'll put a song in here, and we can kind of listen to it and see what these do to the song. So I'm going to, let's go ahead over to our, in here, and let's go grab some music. Okay, so we'll go in here and we'll use some DJ tracks. All right, something with a lot of frequencies in it. We'll use, these are all really, really old songs. We'll use a Nora En Pure track. Nora En Pure stuff is, well mixed, got a lot of frequencies in there. We're just gonna use we're gonna go a new one, we're gonna go to EQs. Overview. And go in here like this, stereo mix, interleaved, yep, good. Boom. Put this into shuffle mode and drag that in there. There we go. Cool. All right, and I'm gonna turn this down because it's gonna be too loud otherwise. And I'm gonna go ahead just real quick, and I'm going to find the tempo. Find the tempo of this. Let's put this all back to the beginning. There we go. Boom, boom. Oops. Come on. There we go. Boom. So we're at 121.6. Okay, so let's see, 122 maybe. That's a little bit different. 120. What happened here? Hold on a second. Oh, that's why. Hold on. I'm gonna grab this and do like this with it. There we go. Yep. That's what happened. There we go. So like that, and let's put this in here like this and make that 2. Oh, I see what it's doing. I had this turned on revert. There we go. That's why. The reason what was happening was it was in my elastic audio was turned on, and to do what I was doing, you do not want to have your elastic audio turned on. Okay. Boom. Yep, 122. Okay. Now I've got my tempo here. I'm just going to drag this out. And I just put my tempo in there so I can like loop some stuff real quick. And we're just going to loop. Cool. Got that one bar, put it in grid mode. Cool, and we'll make this an 8-bar loop. All right, we got that. Now let's go ahead and throw an EQ on here. And what I'm going to use is, we'll use the one that comes with Pro Tools, so we can just take a look at this. Turn my input down a little bit. Okay, so first of all, we have a couple of high pass and low pass filters here on the end, and let's just take a look at this over here. So you got the low cut or high pass, and you got the high cut or low pass. This is a thing that just cuts out all frequencies below a certain point. So what you can do is we can turn this on here like that, and we can move this up or down. You see how it just kind of goes and it cuts out all these frequencies right here. I'm going to make it a little bit steeper here. You can see, and if we listen to it, let's just check this out. You can hear how it's cutting out those low frequencies. So it's a high pass in that it's only passing the high frequencies through, or you could call it a low cut because it's cutting out the low frequencies. Different EQs will call them different things. This one here will do the same thing, just on the opposite end of the spectrum. All right, so you got that there. That's your low pass, high pass, or high cut, low cut. And then we've got our shelves down here, the low frequency shelves. And this one here has 2 shelves, and it's got 3 for the mid frequencies here. And you see how this in button it's turned on. This is basically your on-off button, but it says in. Now you might understand a little bit more about why it says in. So here we got this here. So if I want to add a shelf to this, if I take away, you see how that looks like that? That right there, that's a shelf. And if we look over here at this part here, this is what our shelf looks like. The low shelf adjusts the gain on all frequencies below a certain point. So all the frequencies here below this point are going to be adjusted. And what I can do is I can use my Q to do this. And you can hear it's doing something kind of similar to what our high pass filter was doing, but I can actually use it to go the other way to boost it as well. And I can adjust my frequency here. And then we have this thing here called the Q. And the Q is basically like our bandwidth. So if I pull it down, it's going to be a less drastic shape. If I pull it up, it becomes more drastic. Okay. If I turn it off, we can basically insert it, take it out. Here you can hear all the low frequencies. And here we don't hear the low frequencies at all. And same thing with this side over here. We can boost things, turn things off. And obviously I'm using these really extreme examples. But I think you get the idea. I'm just using this extreme example. Now you see these buttons right here, this button here, and this button here. This can put it into what we call the bell right here. And the bell basically adjusts the gain on frequencies in the middle. And these shelves on this particular EQ can be changed into bells if we want. But these mid ones here are just bells by default. And what this is going to look like if I push it up, it's going to look like a bell. See how it looks like a bell? That's called a bell curve there. And I can adjust the frequencies on it. It only goes up so high. This one goes up to 1K, goes down to 40 Hertz. And if I adjust my bandwidth here, a wider bandwidth like this, and a less wide, a narrower bandwidth like this. So we can adjust the bandwidth there. And that's what the bandwidth means. So I hit play, boost it up. If I adjust my bandwidth, hear how it sounds more, it's got more of a vowel type of sound here. If I widen it out, it it doesn't sound like a special effect. It just sounds like you're making it louder now. And I can pull this back as well. And I can really get into extreme frequencies here, like very precise frequencies by pulling it back and pushing my Q up like this. Okay, and that's an overview of how these work. I don't need to do the high shelf and the high cut because we already kind of did that. I showed it to you. And the mids are all exactly the same. So when we look at this EQ here, this EQ here is doing exactly the same stuff as the EQ I was just showing you in Pro Tools. It's just in Pro Tools you can see what it's doing. In here you can't see it, you just have to listen to it. But if you kind of compare the two back and forth, you're going to understand how these EQs work really well. So you've got your high shelf and your low shelf here, and you got your mids here. The high shelf and the low shelf are these two on the end, right over here. This one and this one. So let's pull that down, see that? Here, let's push this up a little bit. And this, and move that over to here. Maybe push that one up a little bit. Pull this one over here like this. And so we can see how these kind of work and what they kind of look like. And this is what, you can do this, but you're just not going to see it like this on the Audient because you have two mids and you got two shelves. So it's essentially the same as what I have turned on right now in my in my Pro Tools EQ. So I hope that kind of helps to understand how how this EQ works in here. So here's some more kind of just a quick overview of these again. You have the Bell EQ, it's a parametric EQ. Adjust the gain on a sweepable range of frequencies. Fully parametric EQ adjusts the gain and bandwidth on a sweepable range of frequencies. So the difference between just a regular parametric and a fully parametric is that Q knob or the bandwidth knob. The Q is just bandwidth. The controls, you have gain, frequency, and bandwidth right here. So wide bandwidth is going to be more frequencies, and narrow bandwidth is going to be less frequencies. Then you have a shelf EQ. It adjusts all the frequencies below or above a certain point. So it kind of looks like this, and you have controls for this. You have gain, frequency, and sometimes you have the Q there, which is the shelf slope, which is the Pro Tools one has that as well. Now, one thing is when you're working with EQing, if I want to have a couple things, the EQ kind of determines how bright or dark the sound is, how bright or dark, whatever it is you're going for. So there's a couple things. When you want to boost the bass, we can do it a couple ways. One, we could actually just grab the bass and boost it. But when you're doing this, you kind of have to be careful about this because when you're boosting EQ stuff, see what I'm doing here, remember what I said before is that an EQ is essentially a fader on a frequency. Well, when I put that fader right down here at 60 Hertz and I crank it, notice that I'm clipping my output right now. If I put it back to 0 here, notice I'm right around minus 5 dB here on my output. Well, if I crank this up, I'm pushing the output level here. And now I'm clipping the output. Right? And if I push too many of these frequencies, suddenly now we're clipping our output really hard. So we want to be careful when you're EQing that you're not pushing too much. It's okay to push a bit, but really there's a thing called subtractive EQing, and this is something you really need to kind of focus on, especially in the beginning and especially depending on your material. A lot of people want to crank their kick drums and stuff. They really want to make those kick drums be super boomy. And it's okay to boost the low end a little bit, but really what you want to do is instead of saying, I want it to be super bassy and all the bass in the world, well, really what you want to do is say, you know what, maybe what I actually want is less of the mid-tones, and I want more of that low end, but I don't want so much of that mid-tone. And so what you can do is you can actually pull out the mid-tone here, and maybe let's pull out a little bit of highs here, and then I can push my fader. And so I'm not clipping the output of my EQ. I'm now shaping it so that it's got the sound that I want, and then I'm pushing it on my fader here. And this is what we call subtractive EQing. Remember we talked about subtractive mixing. It's the same thing. Remember, everything is relative within a mix. So when you're talking about mixing stuff, if we want to push that low end, well, really what we could do is we could pull out some of the other frequencies and then push up the level of the overall sound so we get a nice even sound coming out and we're not just crushing that low end. There's a lot of misconceptions about how low end works and stuff like that, and especially with younger producers. And I'll see a lot of people, they'll just crank the low end on something, and they're kind of wondering why when they take their mix somewhere else it just sounds like nothing but lows, and you can't hear anything else. And that's because a lot of people don't really understand how that low end actually works. So really what you want to do is you want to think about subtractive EQing. Turn down the elements that are too loud to isolate the frequencies that you want to hear more of. Now with a full mix like this, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of get an idea about that. It's more for individual instruments. When we're talking about subtractive EQing, we are talking about like for a full mix as well, but we're really talking about more individual instruments. So I want you to kind of get in the habit of, before you start just reaching for the low end and turning it up, maybe start to think about, okay, what if I turn down some of my higher elements and then I push the fader on the gain? Now, sometimes you do need to push that low end. It's just what, I mean, it's, you know, I have mixes where I push that low end all the time. But really, if you're pushing that low end like, you know, like this, like up to plus 12 dB, that means that something is kind of a little bit wonky. You probably don't need that. Probably what that means really is that your room is really weak in that frequency, and you need to adjust your speakers in your room and put in some treatment into your room, because if you're not hearing stuff like really loud, or your sample that you're using or your synth you're using is just not the right one. So you have to be aware of that stuff, because if you're hearing things incorrectly in your room, then it's going to translate to a really bad mix with too much bass outside of your room. All right, yep, so here's the short fader. We're just going to keep on here on this input monitor path thing here for a minute, and then we're going to take a break. So the short fader here, number one is your input path versus monitor path. Which one are you using? Number two flips the signal path, so the monitor path is on the short fader. If you want the short fader to have your monitor path on it, then you can push this button. Again, I think I mentioned this yesterday. You're probably not going to be pushing that button at SAE very much, except for maybe just to try it out. Number three is your pan knob for your short fader. You're probably not going to be using that too much, again, at SAE. Then you've got your mix button here. The mix button sends this input path signal to the left-right mix bus. Use this during level setting. We talked about level setting yesterday a little bit. This is when you're going to use this button. Number five is the actual short fader input path trim right here. Basically, it's your fader for that. Almost all the time you're going to leave that at unity, which is 0 right here. You've got your solo button, and you've got your cut button, which is just a fancy name for mute. All right, over here in your long fader, and this right now what we're talking about is right over here. It's this fader, this section across the bottom, the lighter section. What we were just looking at was the darker section right here. Now we're looking at this lighter section down here across the bottom of the board. What we got here is our flip button here. It flips the signal path. Up as monitor path, down as input path. Number three, here's your mix. Number two is just labels. Number three is the mix button. You're almost always going to have this pressed. This is like going to be one of your best friends right here. That mix button right there, and number three. Number four is your panning. Number five is solo. 6 is cut. And then number 1 down here is the long fader itself. And there we go. And now what we're going to do is we are going to pause here. Stop the recording.